welcome to Module 9 of INQ 13, Reassessing Inequality and Reimagining the 21st Century, with a focus on East Harlem. I'm Amanda Matlis, a geography student at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and I'm one of your fellow students in this class. It's a pleasure to introduce our guest speakers for tonight's session on global restructuring, urban inequalities, everyday life, and the right to the city. Cindy Katz is a professor of geography in environmental psychology and women's studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Her work concerns social reproduction and the production of space, place, and nature, children and the environment, and the consequences of global economic restructuring for everyday life. She is the author of Growing Up Global: Economic Restructuring and Children's Everyday Lives, a book that examines the lives of children in both Sudan and Harlem to infer analytical connections between and through places. She is a member of the Solidarity Board of Community Voices Heard, an organization of low-income people, predominantly women, working on welfare reform, job creation, public housing, and other economic justice issues that affect low-income people, particularly low-income women of color in East Harlem and New York City more broadly. Next to her is David Harvey, a distinguished professor of anthropology and geography at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He was the director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, and is the author of numerous books, the most recent titled Rebel Cities: From the Right to the City to the Urban Revolution. His scholarly work and his teachings have been absorbed into the realm of digital scholarship in a variety of ways, making his interpretation of Marx's theories accessible to quite broad and diverse audiences. Though David has not yet been featured in any parodies of the ruling class like the Gangnam Style video, constant speaking engagements, appearances on public access television, and lectures animated in cartoon style turns up well over 400 videos on a YouTube search. His popular video lecture series, Reading Marx's Capital Volume 1 with David Harvey, is freely available on his website, which has received more than 2 million hits. It is absolutely wonderful to have both of these scholars here in dialogue with us as we continue to examine the specifics of social life and politics of East Harlem, today focusing on the effects of global restructuring and ongoing processes of resilience, resistance, and social change in East Harlem. Both Harvey and Katz have developed different critical tools for understanding the geographic terrain of political economic structures and for the enactment and embodiment of liberatory political processes of collective social change. The readings for today traverse a few intersecting threads or roads. Harvey examines the historical link between urbanization and capitalism, developing a radical notion of the right to the city. We've also read 3 of Katz's pieces in which she has discussed her theoretical construct of counter-topographies, a means of recognizing the historical and geographic specificities of particular places, such as East Harlem, while inferring their analytical connections in relation to specific material social practices and reproduction in and across other locales and multiple scales. Both of our guest speakers have worked in coalition with organizations of residents from East Harlem on multiple issues of the reproduction of urban life and politics. So at this point, I will just turn the floor over to them.
Is that a clue for me to say something? I guess it is.
One of you.
Okay, I'll go first. You know, a little while ago, I came across an analysis of the income tax returns for the population of New York City. I don't know if any of you saw this, but it turned out that the average income for the top 1% in New York City was $3.57 million a year. Quite a lot of change, right? That's the average they received. At the other end of the scale, it showed that 50% of the population of New York City is trying to live on less than $30,000 a year. and that a substantial number of people were trying to live on $10,000 a year. Now, it's very difficult to actually get your head around that level of inequality. And I suppose one of the first questions would be where did that level of inequality come from? What produced it? And is this level of inequality different from that which we have seen in American society or other societies within this world we call the capitalist world? And the answer to this is that the levels of inequality now are far worse, are much worse than they have been for some very, very long time. That even in the midst of this crisis that we've been through since 2008, suddenly billionaires have started erupting all over the place, not simply in the United States, but in Mexico. In India, the number of billionaires has doubled over the last 2 years under crisis condition. In China, of course, they've been proliferating. In Russia, in other words, there's a billionaires club which is emerging around the world, which obviously is endowed with incredible amount of wealth and power. And where is all that wealth and power coming from? Well, if you start to look at the kinds of occupations of this billionaires club, it's very different than the sort of thing you would have seen back in 1970 when the levels of inequality were nowhere near as serious as they are now. The billionaires club is dominated by financiers, it's dominated by people in the media, it's dominated by people in, if you like, telecommunications in particular. The richest person in the world right now is not Bill Gates, it's Carlos Slim, a Mexican, who basically made his money out of the privatization of telecommunications in Mexico. That only occurred in early 1990s, and in this brief period over 20 years he's moved from almost nothing to becoming the richest person in the world by extracting vast amounts of money out of those activities. So what we've seen is a shift, if you like, in the locus of power. And of course, New York City, to some degree, has been less affected by the crisis than many other cities, simply because of its concentration in the so-called FIRE industries, which is the finance, insurance, real estate sort of nexus. Now, one of the things that I think we have to recognize is that a lot of wealth is being extracted from the moving wealth around. And therefore the activities we see concentrated in New York City, which is generating that 3.57 million average a year for the top 1%, is coming out of the world of finance and media in particular. At the other end of the scale, you ask yourself the question, how do people live in New York City? Because one of the effects of having that very, very wealthy class is that, present here in New York City, is that housing prices are sky high. To find a place to live in Manhattan these days is almost impossible, given the prices to buy or to rent. So you have a real kind of issue in the city that not only do you have social inequality in aggregate, but you've really got the problem of where do people trying to live on less than $30,000 a year live, and how do they live where they live. And of course what we see is a great deal of segregation in the city, which is based in part upon this income stream, but then there are other forms, of course, of the segregation which have to do with race and sexual preference and the like. But I realized what this was about recently several times when coming into Kennedy Airport at 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, if you take the E train in from at 6:30 in the morning, the next to last stop on the E line is the one that connects to Kennedy Airport, and the train that comes in at 6:30 in the morning is packed with people. It's packed with people who are, for the most part, women. For the most part, women of colour. And they are all going into the city to wake the city up. Get the coffee ready so the suits can come in 2 hours, 3 hours later, and it's all the coffee's ready, and so on. But there they are at 6:30 in the morning, coming in from way, way out in Jamaica. And this is about, it's about a 45-minute ride from there into the centre of the city. The thing that struck me about this was they all looked dead tired as they were going to work. I mean, people were sort of sitting there trying to get a last few minutes of a nap. This is an exhausted population which is living way out on the fringes and has long commutes, probably working for almost, minimum wage at best. And they are the people who are trying to live on $30,000 a year or less. And they are living in a certain part of New York City. Most people, I don't think any of the rich folk take the 6:30 sort of E-train coming in from Kennedy Airport at that time in the morning. If they are rich and they're coming in from Kennedy, they take a limo and come in. They would never go on the subway. So here's this inequality, which is absolutely astounding, and in part it's been produced through 30 years of neoliberalism and 30 years of neoliberal policies, which have been strategically about actually releasing wealth to the more affluent, on the theory that the more affluent, when they get wealthy, will actually use their money to invest and create jobs. But they've not invested in such a way as to create jobs. What they've invested in is they've invested in property. They've interested in the stock market. They've invested in asset values. They haven't actually invested very much in anything productive. They haven't actually created jobs at all. What they've done is actually boom the stock market and gain even more money out of the booming of the stock market. Some of them got caught in the crash of 2008, but a lot of them did not. So here you have this world which has been created over the last 30 or 40 years of policies which have been biased entirely towards the rich. And I jokingly say to people who are very concerned about poverty in the city that they're in the wrong organisation if they're in an anti-poverty organisation. They should join an anti-wealth organisation. Because that's where the real problem lies. It's the actual extraction of vast amounts of wealth by a very small group and elite. And that group has been actually in charge of politics. It commands politics because it basically buys politics. The Mark Twain joke about Congress, that it's the best Congress that money can buy. Well, this is the group that has the money to buy it. And essentially they buy the political process, they buy the judicial process via the political process, they buy the media, they buy everything. So in a sense we live in an oligarchy where certain things are actually kind of structured around their wants and needs. And you can see this in things like the Bush tax cuts, you can see this in the Reagan tax cuts. The whole policies and politics were to actually encourage the concentration of wealth in this particular class. And it has devastating consequences for New York City. Manhattan, by and large, has become one vast gated community, a gated community for the rich and the affluent. And of course the policies that have been initiated, first under Koch, but particularly under Giuliani, and then onwards, have been very much about promoting Manhattan as a place for global capital to come, for global wealthy classes to have a pied-à-terre. So the global wealthy classes are now buying apartments on Park Avenue for over $100 million. Actually, they don't live there. That's the extraordinary thing. Half of those apartments are empty because people have one there, they have a place in the Bahamas, they have one in London, And whether they're living in the one in New York, it doesn't matter. So they add absolutely nothing, if you like, to the vibrancy of the city as a political entity, nothing whatsoever. At the same time as actually driving up the prices in such a way that the mass of the population has no access to housing, has no access to resources. And on top of that, we now have this famous debt crisis, which is generating a politics of austerity, and a politics of austerity that is actually undermining and undercutting the standards of living of the most vulnerable populations. So what we see is a politics which is a class-based politics. And we're seeing the emergence around us of a class-based segregation in this city, which I think has very many problems attached to it in terms of the viability of the city as what I would call a body politic, as a place where people can come together and to have some notion of a collective interest. And of course we have a mayor, Bloomberg, who happens to be from that class, with all of the interest that he has close to that class. And he has used the public sector to initiate many public projects, which are many projects of public-private partnership usually, which are very much along this class-biased term. So what we have to think about, therefore, is to think about a politics which is going to reverse all of that. And one of the reasons that I like to write about the right to the city is to say, is there some collective way in which the inhabitants of a city, all of those people travelling into the city on the E-train at 6:30 in the morning, can somehow or other gain a voice in which they can start to talk about what kind of city they would like to build, how their vision of the city can actually be incorporated into the things that begin to happen in the city. Because right now, what happens in the city is essentially dominated by a very small, wealthy elite. And that very small, wealthy elite is building the city that it likes, not the city that is actually worthy of the whole population who lives here. So what to do about it, maybe we can talk about that as we go on, and talk about some of the forms of social organisation and social struggle which exist in this city around right to the city and community voices heard and organisations like that Cindy is involved in. I've been tangibly sort of connected over the last few years with the Right to the City group in the city, in the hope that there can emerge a politics which is going to reverse this inequality. But at some point or other, I think people have to understand that this inequality cannot last and has to give way to something radically different. So with that, let me turn over to Cindy and that.
Something radically different.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I want to think about that, the journey from the E-train, prior to the E-train, because it's also stretched out internationally. So where did those mostly non-white, mostly women come from to get to live in the outermost boroughs of New York? And that's other places in the global south for the most part. And so there's this kind of stretch of inequality across cities, across nations, and across national boundaries that we have to look at as well. So that's one thing, and the other thing is that I want to pick up just to make a thread from what David was saying, is that those tax cuts that these oligarchs and billionaires or millionaires have instated, and the kind of rich people's politics, the purchase of a political formation, is manifest in particular kinds of disinvestments and particular kinds of dispossessions. I mean, to use the language that you've made so vibrant of accumulation by dispossession, that accumulation, those tax cuts play out in particular ways. And the way that I've looked at them and what kind of grabs my political passions is about social reproduction and mostly because I can imagine the entire world in and around social reproduction. But in order for a social formation to persist, including a capitalist one, there has to be social reproduction. And that means the means of production as well as a differentiated labor force. It has to be, it's precisely not a revolutionary concept. It could be because there's so much power that inheres in what takes place in social reproduction, but in order for that, there's a struggle over it, and it's geographically and historically determined, but the struggle is around who does what. Where does the labor of reproducing a social formation, the means of production, the machinery, the environment, and the workforce come from? And is it from capital in the form of the workplace? Is it from the state? Is it from individuals and households? And one of the things about the neoliberal turn of the last 30 years is there's been an enormous offloading of those costs to households and to individuals from the state and from capital. And so how that takes place is a serious question about accumulation. Who does that care, as now there's an interest in calling it caring work, but who pays for, who is doing the caring work, who's paying for the caring work, and where does that transfer of wealth and value and labor power come from? So one area where there's been enormous disinvestment is around these questions. Social housing. The idea, I love language, so I sort of collect terms that don't have parallels, like working mother. There are no working fathers, apparently, they're all unemployed. But affordable housing is one that suggests, what is unaffordable housing? For whom are we talking? So we barely have affordable housing to begin with, as David made clear. But also, there's now, as the public space in public housing projects is being expropriated and privatized, like community centers, open spaces, parking lots are being given 99-year leases, as you might have talked about in the housing one, to be privatized. One of the deals is that there be really, really affordable housing in those spaces. So it's already giving the lie to the idea that there's something that is affordable housing. But so a disinvestment in social housing, a disinvestment in public education, a disinvestment in public spaces of everyday life, a disinvestment in social welfare, of course, a disinvestment in health care. And all of these things are part of the tax vengeance, the refusal to pay taxes. And one of the ways then those things get accomplished or provided is offloaded onto individuals, but also through public-private partnerships, which are a way for the wealthy and the ruling class and capitalist corporations to say, we'll pay for this, but not that. We're interested in parks, but not in that outer borough where those brown women are commuting from. We want Central Park to look terrific, and it does. And we want Bryant Park to be a wonderful space and have pop-up ice skating and fashion and, all these things that we, who are, at least in a socially middle-class formation, I know what fellowships are, but can enjoy. But there's a way that doesn't come from taxes anymore. It doesn't come from the state. I mean, I don't want to make an argument that all I want is the state to come back, because I always say, come back, state, so we could smash you. But there needs to be a way for there to be collective social responsibility for the reproduction of a social life, of a vibrant city, of a differentiated working population, and not a sense that there's a city for the wealthy, that work gets produced by an underpaid, underemployed, transnational, gendered, racialized labor force, so that the inequality streams get deployed into servicing this oligarchic city, but also that the disinvestments, the shards of the disinvestments are left to all those poor people who are excluded from the possibility of a viable kind of future, of a working future. So we don't have, there is, I've said this phrase in several places, but since it's grammatically wrong, it's memorable. There is not no money. We have not had a disinvestment in policing or in the military, and part of that is because the categorization of who's important and whose futures matter and who is likely to be a laboring body in the future is constituted around around accessing whole populations, and therefore their management and containment in prisons, in the military, in detention centers, and they're all of a piece. So that's an enormous, we do have great public housing investment if you call prisons public housing, and that's not my joke, bad joke. So how do those decisions get made? How is it that there's a refusal of a kind of taxing the wealthy, the resistance to taxing these millionaires, or even the top 10% who would not notice, a few percentage increase in their taxes, and the wealth, anyway, all know this, but a refusal to even suggest that when there is at the same time an excessing of population, a kind of dispossession or disinvestment in schools so that they don't educate people, a disinvestment in viable safety nets, a disinvestment in things that would sustain a vibrant social cultural life. And to turn this into a kind of political question that's, again, not, I think we could talk about what kinds of activism works around this, but in where the kind of circuits of these questions around social reproduction go for me is to look at the construction and the everyday lives of children, and if you read any part of, I'm sure there were children in the things you read, but the current work I'm doing is looking at these inequalities around childhood and this notion of what I'm calling childhood as spectacle. But because of this precarity and this insecurity around the political economic situation, the political ecological situation, and the geopolitical situation, there's many reasons to be concerned about the future, many reasons to be politically active in any one of those arenas and more. But a lot of times it becomes overwhelming and people retreat from political organizing. And for me, I look at how it produces a kind of anxiety that leads to managing one's children. And so it produces this idea of the child as accumulation strategy and commodity and ornament that are the children of privilege at the expense and built upon the child as waste. And the child as waste is the child in public schools that are disinvested, the child in detention, the children who who are not having access to all the resources, but a saturation of resources in the same way that we see it in terms of millionaires and this discrepancy between the wealthiest few percent and the whole rest of the economy, a saturation of resources, in particular children, and I'm not going to go into all the things that the saturation of resources involves, but a refusal to put any resources into social childhood, which is other people's children. And so a kind of wasting of the next generation And that waste has to be managed. And if you've been in the garbage business, as I have not, you know, though, that there's a lot of money in waste management. And that's where the other sites of social investment come in, like prisons and the military and juvenile containment. And so I think about what is the politics that would respond to a future in which we have not overpopulation, but we have a way to accomplish production with fewer hours of work, with fewer hours of labor power. And so why do we not have a notion of a reduced work week with equal pay, rather than some people are working 10,000 hours for $1 an hour, and some people are making zillions, or many people are unemployed while other people are, kind of scrapping together some jobs, where we could say, you know what, we have 19th century production relations, and we're in the 21st century. Why do we stick with this? I mean, the 35-hour, the 40-hour week was a major achievement 100 years ago. And we've whittled it down in some places to 35 hours. But we could actually work 25 hours a week and have more people working and have more, I know this is, but this is like, it's not, everybody's sort of, oh, yeah, that sounds good. But also, you produce disposable time, which is actually, I'm making an advertisement for capitalism here, because then that's where creativity happens, but it's also where consumption happens. It doesn't necessarily transform the social formation, which is what I would be interested in doing, but to rethink work and care and how we reproduce a labor force and what constitutes a prepared labor force and what constitutes the means of production, like an environment that is reproducible and sustainable rather than degraded and used up like certain parts of the population. So I'll throw that out there as a political project and stop there. I don't know how long. It felt 15 minutes-ish. Are we supposed to?
Great.
Are we supposed to talk to each other?
So yeah, we'll definitely want to open it up to questions between the two of you and other people who are here.
It's not so much a question as a comment. I mean, I think this idea of we're moving into a kind of society in general, I think, where there are many people are not ever going to find a job. And therefore you've got a perpetual excess population. And that population is essentially being politically treated right now as disposable, mm-hmm. as waste, if you want to call it that. And we're not even looking that macro question in the eye. Now, the reason this is happening is partly to do with the political things that we've mentioned, but I think also the transformation of technologies, the automation which is coming in, which is beginning now to affect even white-collar jobs. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you saw this stuff about even medical diagnoses very soon are going to be done by machines and no longer by doctors. Mm-hmm. So that actually there's going to be less and less kind of work. Even for those who are managed to be in the workforce. So this then raises kind of questions about, to begin with, what is that population going to do? Where is its effective demand going to come from? How is its form of support going to be there? Can it be absorbed by some form of job sharing or a reduction of? I mean, there are all these kinds of questions which it seems to me have to be put on the table, but nobody seems to be really thinking about in a macro kind of way, mm-hmm. what that might mean and what that might mean for urban life. Because also, as we have more and more of a disposable population that might have lots of hours on its hands, the public spaces where it can actually go into are
Are
being
privatized.
privatized and turned into places where people can't go. Or if they still remain public, like Washington Square or something like that, they start having tulip beds instead of places where people can interact. So I wonder whether we shouldn't be talking a little bit more about all of that, because I think that's a very crucial point.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that disposability is paramount to me. We really don't need all the all the
Right.
labor time that we are, sort of imagined to need. But rather than that any sort of collective response to that, or imaginative response, like let's cut the work week, call it job sharing. But rather we say this population that's disposable, that's waste, can be disposed of, has to be contained and managed. Well, there's money in
Right,
that,
right.
rather than like a socially, sort of productive notion of what to do with a different time space of production and social reproduction. And then instead of employing people who are here, there's a kind of labor immigration is a sort of extended extraction of labor from of the labor of caring work and social reproduction from someplace else.
Yeah.
Just let's import a cheaper labor force because somebody else in another country produced them as a worker, and is no doubt still sustaining them in certain ways, so that they can be disposed of when their working life is done and go back to Mexico or back to the Philippines and be cared for in a different way. But we're not looking in the eye this idea that, I didn't want to say some people are not going to get jobs, since every graduate student is nervous that they might be some of those people. So even at this end of life, there's a different looming future that needs to be reimagined, reworked.
Yeah.
Instead of seen as an investment opportunity.
Can I just make a comment on this line of thought? I think what you're saying, it's certainly a big, thinking a lot into the future. But as you mentioned, there is the possibility, or there is money to be made from managing excess populations, right? And we see, for example, the rise of private prisons over the last 20 years, from at least what I know, over the last 20 years. There's also now money to be made from managing debt and student debt, for example. And I think it's definitely possible to share all the work that there has been in the world. I think that we could reduce the work week to 25 hours. Certainly, why not? That's an arbitrary number. But and we definitely can employ technology. There's, for example, a new software called SAG Grader, which helps adjuncts grade undergraduate student papers.
You'll be soon be made redundant too, right? Because the
Even
software
the
will do-
adjuncts won't be.
Right.
And it's not just adjuncts.
Right, but I just, what I want to get to here is, just that I think then there is the question
Yeah.
of money,
Yeah.
right? The question of money as social power, and then also the question of borders and their use to manage populations, which in the end I think it comes to the question of what kind of political state do we need? What kind of governance bodies do we need? As you outlined, David, I think the current forms of government we have are very much class-dominated for one class, by one class. And that's, I think, the political projects that I would like to think about are to move beyond those kinds of forms of governance. And my question is, for you more specifically, why do we begin in the city? Why is your book From the Right to the City to the Urban Revolution, your newer book?
Yeah.
I kind of have an idea, but perhaps you could expand on why the city, and why now?
I think in many ways, I think the whole world is essentially urbanized now. I mean, people like to say that 50% of the world's population lives in cities, but actually there are very few people in the world whose lives do not depend upon some connectivity with the urban network. I mean, if people live in the woods in New Hampshire, many of them actually are communicating with the city. They're part of the urban network. So once upon a time, it made sense to talk about there was a rural kind of society with its independent culture and forms, and then there was an urban society, and there was some sort of schism between them, and that therefore there was a tension between the city and the countryside, or between urban and rural. I think that's all disappeared since 1945 in much of the world, and in those parts of the world where it did continue to be the case, it's quickly being transformed, as in China, for example. You're seeing a rapid urbanization of China, but also the connectivity of rural populations in China to what's going on in the urban network. So in many ways, I think of urbanization as now being a global phenomenon, and essentially the world is sort of networked in this kind of way. So I wanted to talk about urbanization. But one of the ways to talk about it politically is to actually use the idea of the city, which has a long sort of history about the relationship between city and citizenship, of belonging. There is also the idea of the city as some sort of utopian vision of a future. So there's a political idea about the city, which is about something about a way of life which is collective, which can be established. So I wanted to draw upon that sort of, if you like, tradition of thinking about the city as a political objective. And as I said in the book, I think in many ways urbanization has destroyed the city. And it's now we need to rebuild the city on the ruins of capitalist urbanization. Because capitalist urbanization, in a funny kind of way, is anti-city. It's anti the idea of a political entity in which people can, relate to each other and collectively arrive at decisions. And I think that one of the things that was so interesting about the Occupy movement, in particular, say the Indignado movement in Spain, was the way in which people tried to come back together at the centre. And the same in Syntagma Square in Athens, they tried to come back together, and by setting up these assemblies, started to think about actually regaining the city as a place where decision making could collectively be arrived at. So I think there is something to be gained from building upon that tradition and saying in what ways can we actually recuperate the city as a political idea and as a utopian vision to deal with the way in which cities right now have been destroyed by this urbanization process, which is about gated communities and fragments and defended spaces all over the place. So it's very hard right now in a metropolitan region to imagine a political process where it can all be put back together. And one of the things that I think that Occupy, if it had managed to continue and hadn't been so quickly suppressed, and as I think still trying to do, is to come up with some sort of vision for the city as a whole, which is, like I say, a political division. It's about belonging, it's about incorporation, about collective decisions about what the city should be, and how it should be managed and how it should be run and governed. So that's, if you like, the idea I had in mind by talking about using the right to the city as a way to start to think about an urban revolution.
Cindy, would you mind talking about your ideas around the right to the city? Around that also, it's just like kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that, but I don't I haven't used that language of right to the city. I feel like there, and maybe it's because of my lack of imagination or my singular idea, but I feel like a lot of what the right to the city is about is drawing on the ideas of what I think about as social reproduction and around a kind of collective social life. And it's kind of usurped that language and maybe neglected some of the, some of the kind of collective players who were interested, have labored around welfare rights, around school, privatization of schools, or the demise of playgrounds, the disinvestments in parks. So the things that I think about and kind of insist on framing within the notion of social reproduction to show the ways that its privatization takes away the, to use the language of right to the city, the rights of certain people to the city in order to produce a city that the right has rights to, so that I prefer to, I'm kind of sticking to my old language, but I think that the ideas are mostly shared, don't you think?
Yeah.
So, and the sort of privatization of the city, which is a shared collective cultural, social body, or a really thriving, throbbing body, is one that that privatization takes away pieces of it, cordons it off, and makes a certain kind of city within the neglected city. Or
Yeah,
now that I had a language.
One of the things I remember when the Right to the City of New York was producing a sort of a platform as to what they were after, and one of the segments was what to say and do about public space. And there was a very interesting discussion because I think the initial formulation that we were in was very defensive. How do we defend public spaces from being privatized and turned into tulip beds or for tourists and that kind of stuff? But then after a while, I think people recognized that maybe the mission should be to open up. It should be aggressive. It's about opening up new public spaces, or taking state spaces, for instance, like schools or something like that, and saying these are actually potentially public spaces, and we should therefore find public functions that can be connected to all of this state. Because it turns out that a lot of the state properties in the city, which you would think are public spaces, are not public at all. They're fenced in and as secure as anything else. So they're not. So the amount of genuine public space in the city where you can go do something different other than the streets and so on has been shrinking. So is there programmatically a way in which you can start to think about opening up the public spaces, opening up new public spaces, and conceptualizing some of the spaces that currently exist, which are run by the state, and insisting that they be turned into genuine public spaces for other activities. And I came across in Sao Paulo, for example, examples where all the schools were becoming, if you like, public spaces. And I think that in Argentina, one of the great things about the recuperated factories is the factories are, go into collective ownership, but one of the things that immediately happens is the people running the factories start to use the factory space for cultural activities. And they start to become centers also for even barter networks of goods and things. So you break down the spaces of the city in such a way that you open up all kinds of new possibilities, and a lot of this has to do with integrating spaces which have a specialized function into the general sphere of what you're talking about in terms of social reproduction. And I think that's one of the things that arose out of in consideration of the platform of the right to the city was to start thinking about public spaces in New York City in that kind of way, rather than thinking about, oh well, can we defend Bryant Park from becoming entirely occupied by fashion models and things like that, so it becomes a genuine, open sort of
Pacification
public
by
cappuccino,
cappuccino.
as we like to call it. Can we defend it? So instead of defending it, you kind of say, well, okay, let's defend it, but then let's go take some other spaces and open them up and kind of say, hey, let's use these as places. As happened in a way with what Occupy did. It turned Zuccotti Park into a genuine public space. And then what happens? Well, the police come in and tell them you can't do it, and that's kind of bang, 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 And it's amazing how quickly political power went to stop what was actually a very creative kind of move.
What you were saying there's, as geographers, I think we're always trying to insert space into things, but I want to insert some time. And, like we always say, geography and history and space and time. But the privatization of time, as well as the privatization of space, is a really interesting part of the problem right now. And when you were talking, it reminded me of this. I worked on these schoolyards in Harlem a long time ago, but they were part of community schools, which were supposed to be open and accessible 24 hours a day. And they were supposed to be true community centers. Of course, they weren't open 24, but then they were supposed to have programming that would be there for the community, kids in the community to have access to in a time of intensive privatization. So there was this, then it became disinvestment in after-school programs, and we can't have you have to pay, they have to be for a fee, they have to be run by a private organization. So the public spaces that are there then get fenced off, and the kind of public time and the possibility of public collective shared social activities is limited to programs, there's not, and this is one of my things because I work with children, there's not like free play, there's recreation. It's very different to be doing recreation programming and playing outside and doing, as I've said in a conference that Wendy organized, doing nothing is the privilege of a great childhood. Like, doing nothing is what we all did, and still I do. But that becomes really kind of an impossible thing when spaces are totally structured, when programming is what a child's life is all about, and when there's kind of saturation programming for certain children and then containment programming for other children. So that time becomes privatized too.
Yeah.
I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about technology and the connections between wealth being extracted and with Carlos Slim, and the coincidence or direct connection between control of means of communication and the rise of new elites, and also the relationship between using new media as a tool for social change and organizing, and any contradictions or challenges that you see with regard to that, and also the privatization, or that these are new spaces and fields for either exploitation or fields for greater dialogue between communities.
Well, as the last couple of sentences you said, it's contradictory, and it's not like the social media is the salvation or the bane of our existence. I think there is a lot to be said for the ways social media have been used to alert people, to connect people, to all of this, the kind of attention to the Arab Spring and to Occupy, but also there was a ton of organizing on the ground that got occluded by the romance of the Twitter revolution. And if there's not organizing on the ground, all that communication is not going to lead to much, except for like maybe a co-presence for a brief moment and then not much else. And the other thing in terms of time is the colonization of our time by these media. I am at the point where, this is my own thing about the sidewalks and streets of the city, where nobody seems to actually be collectively present. Everyone is walking around texting or checking their email or looking at, I don't know what they're doing, but I'm starting to kick them. But I consciously don't avoid people who are walking down the street like this so that I can bump into them, so they might wake up and say, we are in a street together. We are in this fantastic city. We are citizens. The meaning of the urban is being destroyed by these technologies. And also our lives are being colonized. It's hard to be away from that information flow. To what purpose? So I know that's not quite what you were asking, but I do think there's a kind of deep privatization of time and solitary, I don't know the word, but making people solitary in shared environments, not co-present at all. There's a kind of greatness that you could be saying right now in this POOC to someone in India, we have the same problem, isn't this true? That's part of my, the promise of what I think of encounter topographies. But there's also a way that be here now, be in this room talking to people who are in this room, or be on the street with me seeing something that I'm seeing, not texting your Uncle Louie or whoever you're texting. So I don't know, that's my rant, but I got derailed. But I think it fits into what we're talking about privatization and distraction. I think the dangers are as compelling as the possibilities in terms of social media. I really think there could be a demonstration that people might not see because they're so. Get in the elevator here. I feel like I'm the only one not looking at my phone. As I kind of get with the program, I take it out, see what time it is.
Yes.
But you're in this space, and you feel like I don't know.
It's one of those things. I don't know how really to use mine, but I get it out and look and pretend just because I just.
Maybe everyone's
just to impress
pretending.
everybody. Who was it called? The weapons of mass distraction.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the media is about that. But obviously, in certain situations, it becomes absolutely crucial in terms of the capacity to mobilize very quickly and very fast. But it's like anything else. It's like the phone and everything else. It's a double-edged sword. It can be used one way and it can be used another. And how it's used is just, then depends on what people's wants, needs, and desires are. And right now, it seems to me that what I see is a lot of kind of, who's sleeping with who kind of discussion rather than what can we do politically about, the social inequality in this city.
We don't even look at it anymore.
Right.
But and then there's the kind of self-surveillance aspect of it. Gregory Donovan's work of the surveillance part. But the fun, the face recognition. We all put in our iPhone. Well, we maybe don't, but the names of everyone, and then it turns out the police are using this software in demonstrations. The way, please do this thing to get through passport control faster, and then you've got your, they can zone in, and we have all produced the information. Turn on your location device so Siri can guide you to the next mall. So just, And it seems that in this thing in Boston yesterday, that the person chose that place to put the bombs because it's the finish line and everybody's there recording. So it's like mass effect too, like this will be seen by 1 million people because it's where people are with cameras, you know, as opposed to kill more people in a subway but nobody sees, you know, if you kill 100 people in the subway, did it happen? As opposed to on the street where everybody's got their cell phones. But yeah, the mobilization part is great. Do you have insights about this?
No, I mean, I'm one of the few people who hasn't yet had a Facebook page and that type of a thing. I turned in my BlackBerry after I had a job that required that, and then the people at the store were dumbfounded that I would do something like that. They said, "Why would you do that? Why would you give up the BlackBerry?" And I just shrugged my shoulders and I said, "The economy." And and I couldn't really say anything after that, so I just got my regular phone, which came with the camera. And I said, "No, I don't want a camera." And he said, "Well, they all come with them." And I said, "Well, but I just wanted a phone." Like, well, lucky you, now you got a phone and a camera. But that's a part of what you're saying here is like, these are devices that I'm not even really wanting to opt into, but they're all being included, you know, for the enhancement of my life, which is, I think I can determine what enhances my life.
Yeah.
I think your phone knows better.
It's like a vestigial organ or something, the camera. But it seems like maybe what's sort of being talked about here is the need to make much finer cuts on some of the language that you have of de-skilling and then re-skilling. What does that mean as part of a political project, since we're talking about all these technologies and the ways that they can go wrong or better, but how to think about, I mean, I think about the process of developing a revolution as part of an, you know, an Occupy participant or a scholar or something like that as a kind of reskilling, but that remains to be seen. What does that mean? And I think that there's lots of like utopian possibilities there, but we also have to be so specific about what that means and how it connects.
Like
to different
specific
things.
about what skills people need.
Yeah, but I also want to be careful not to talk about it in a totally I do want to talk about it in a programmatic way because there are ways that it needs to scale up, but not in a way that seems managerial again. So, you know, I think I'm trying to like blend your languages together in some ways, but also talk about my own sort of experience as an occupier or something like that, and the skills that I think we've all kind of been developing or trying out or something like that. I don't know if that resonates with anyone in the work.
I know Hector has a question as well.
And just on the question of technology, I mean, I think what we're trying to do in this class is to experiment with, definitely with the internet, certainly to see if we can make a dent, I think, on massively open online courses and to experiment, see how we can shape participatory open online courses, right? To, in a sense, to propose an alternative. And I think we cannot, or at least from the way I've been looking at technology, is that this comes embedded with class relations in it, right? It has to run out of power at some point. First of all, I have to recharge it, I have to depend on these infrastructural, but it also is going to become obsolete, right? Which is planned obsolescence within the product. So technologies currently come with with class relations embedded in them, you know? And so I think that technology, perhaps we can be a little more, maybe not as strict about calling something like a phone a weapon of mass distraction, perhaps. Although it can be that, but I think it can also be a tool for activism, like there is the stop and frisk application that people use to track police frisking on people, right? Where you can report, police surveillance or police abuse. So, I think it's also a terrain for contestation.
Yeah, that's a great example.
You know, it's also a terrain for contestation, I think, technology, and I think that if we think of a post-capitalist technology, we can, sure, I think, take what we've kind of come up with
but we will have to move to eventually, I think, a technology that does not come embedded with capitalist class relations, but with different class relations or with different social relations in it, you know?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if we want to go like down this road because I feel like we're moving away a bit from the arguments. But I also feel like we can't talk about technology as like one mass technology. I think there's very differentiated. Maybe this is what you're talking about, and the use and the actual technology that is available. So I mean, that there's not like one scale of technologies. I feel like, you know, another example would be, you know, the way that cell phones were used to report from the ground, you know, what was happening in Haiti, for example, and you know, in the context of both the earthquake and also of the elections, and that is not, people are not using apps, people are not using, these are SMS enabled phones, which are just a basic flip phone. I don't think there's camera embedded actually. But I think that also occupies a very different terrain in terms of its instrumentality, of how it can and why it is that it's being used. Now, the political economic structure is a different thing, right? I mean, you got Salim in Mexico, you got, you know, all these other like mega companies. It's not that, you know, there's somebody who developed this technology in Haiti and is suddenly spreading it to, you know, the fellow Haitians. It's really coming from these mega corporations, and I think that's another layer to it. But you know, even in talking about this app, we're already talking about a device that holds this app, which is not readily accessible to many people, even in the U.S. And even in many of the communities that, you know, we know are very affected by stop and frisk policies.
So I think we're just, if there's any concluding remarks, because speaking of space and time, we are about out of time here. So if anybody wants to, any final moments, thoughts?
Can I ask one final question? So what does give you, either of you, hope and inspiration?
Well, I have hope on Thursday, inspiration on Friday, and despair on Saturday. It sort of goes like that, you know. I mean, I think right now it's very easy to get depressed when you look around. And then you see something or hear something that makes you think, well, things are going differently. I mean, about these technologies, for example, the cell phone has revolutionized life for relatively low-income population in rural areas, for example, in Latin America. You see them all over the place. And Africa too, yeah. And now people can actually bank and things like that through their cell phone. So it's actually revolutionizing all kinds of things. And I think, you know, you kind of hear that part of it. And then I see all the people going down the street and doing this kind of thing all the time. And I rode the train down from New York to Baltimore, which is about 3 hours, and there was a woman behind who had a continuous conversation all the way in a very loud voice. So I know all about her personal life and everything else, you know. So this drives me nuts, you see. So you go from it driving you nuts 1 minute to the next minute, you see what the real possibilities are. And I think that, and this is a typical capitalist dilemma. Capitalism produces capacities, powers, and possibilities which are absolutely remarkable. And then what you see is people not using it in a way to actually colonize it or appropriate it in a way. So you find yourself sort of like I say, you know, one day I'm kind of very optimistic and say, wow, you know, with all of that we could do all of this and could do this, and you know, it seems like it's all open. And then you look at how, you know, some people are just using it in this other way, and you kind of get, so yeah, that's my answer. It depends on the day.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the fact of Occupy and its spread and the so-called Arab Spring, that those things were almost inconceivable months before they happened. And they happened. And it wasn't just the technologies that connected people, but it was that people had been organizing in various ways, that there was labor organizing, there was anti-prison organizing, there was anti-military, anti-imperial organizing, and so there's lots of people who are involved. I mean, what gives me hope in a kind of daily, not that I go there daily, but to go to Community Voices Heard and to work with people who are, really activists in terms of reclaiming some part of their right to the city, and the kind of ways they connect to larger questions, to the fact that it's not just about housing in East Harlem, but it's also about CUNY. And then it's not just about CUNY, it's about, state welfare reform. Or, they started as an anti-WEP organization, so the work employment program, the welfare employment, it's the slave labor program that was, I'm sure you all know about, but that they then moved into housing. But they connected, from one of the things that inspired me is they connected to Brazilian activists in urban neighborhoods in Sao Paulo and in Rio. They were kind of forming these solidarities and saying, we're facing this too. Now, did it cause world revolution? No, but it was a kind of organizing that's there, and even in the kind of pushback around Occupy, or in the various uneven outcomes from the various countries that were in protest in Northern Africa and other Arabic-speaking parts of the world. There's, it's precarious. It's not beautiful in most places. So there's a lot of pushback, but there's, I think, seeing that possibility keeps people going. For me, that it does end. Not to be corny, but teaching. Like being part of Nice Guy. We have the New York City Geographical Expedition and Institute, and we have a little bit of money from Antipode. And it's funny that you said defense, because we're conceptualizing the connections among our different projects as community defense projects. So we're defending against different things in different communities, but it's to have a kind of social the social reproduction of a neighborhood that encompasses a more vibrant and collective social life. Is that a good way to put it?
Sounds really good.
Sounds really good. We're going to try and do it. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Yeah, what an amazing dialogue, and thanks for helping us to stretch our imaginations and reimagine and reassess inequality. And thanks everybody for your contributions. You can visit us on our blog at inq13.gc.cuny.edu. And next week we will be live streaming a talk by Linda Tui Y. Smith. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.